Welcome back, everyone. We're kicking off another deep dive today, and this time we're cracking open Paul Bloom's book, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind.
Oh, this is a good one. It really gets you thinking about how our minds work or, sometimes how they don't work.
Exactly. So we're going to cover a ton of ground today, from the basics of the brain all the way to those crazy social behaviors we all experience.
It's like a backstage pass to your own mind.
I love that. All right, let's start with a story that always gets to me, the case of Phineas Gage, that railroad worker who had a metal rod, literally go through his head.
Yeah, talk about a bad day at work.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is, he survived.
I know, right? But he wasn't the same after that. Went from a totally responsible guy to, impulsive and erratic.
Right, and this was back in the 1800s, so it was one of the first clues that the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain behind your forehead, plays a huge role in personality. It's like the control center for planning, decision-making, all that good stuff.
So, 1 minute you're employee of the month, the next you're, Phineas Gage. But then Bloom tells us about this other guy, Greg F., who starts going blind and thinks it's a spiritual awakening, not a medical problem.
It's a powerful example of how much our beliefs can shape our reality. Our minds are constantly trying to make sense of the world, even if it means bending the facts a bit.
Makes you think, huh? But for centuries, this idea that the mind and body are totally separate entities was the dominant theory.
Yes, classic dualism. Descartes and his, I think, therefore I am.
It's intuitive, right? Our thoughts feel so different from our physical bodies.
Like they're in different zip codes. But modern neuroscience is saying, hold up, not so fast.
Yeah, Bloom uses this kind of funny image to drive this point home. Imagine aliens mistaking us for sentient meat, just walking slabs of meat, completely missing the importance of the brain.
Sentient meat. I like that. But okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are those billions of tiny cells in our brains that make us, not just meat? Neurons. Think of them as tiny messengers, constantly zipping messages back and forth. They have these branch-like things called dendrites that receive signals, then a cell body that processes the information, and then it's sent out a long cable called an axon.
It's like a relay race with information.
Exactly. And for a long time, scientists debated how these signals jumped from one neuron to the next. This tiny gap, called a synapse, was the mystery.
Oh, I remember reading about that. Was it called the War of the Soups and the Sparks? Something like that.
You got it. Soups for chemical signals, sparks for electrical ones. Turns out Team Soup won. Chemical messengers, called neurotransmitters, carry those signals across the synapse.
So with all these neurons firing constantly, why did our brains feel like, a fireworks show all the time?
Good question. We're not consciously aware of every single signal. Our brain filters out a ton of information, only bringing the important stuff to our attention. Thank goodness, right?
Right. Otherwise, we'd be completely overloaded. So how do we figure out that different parts of the brain do different things?
Well, we had some interesting detours along the way. Remember phrenology?
Wait, that thing where they felt your skull to determine your personality?
Seriously?
Yep, that was a thing. Totally debunked, but it shows how long we've been trying to map the brain.
So, phrenology. Wrong map, right idea.
Exactly. Today we have some pretty amazing tools, like fMRI, which lets us see brain activity in real time.
So no more skull feeling, huh? What would that even tell you?
Not much, thankfully. But Bloom focuses on two key areas, the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex.
Okay, those sound familiar. Remind me again what they do.
Think of them like maps of your body and your brain. The motor cortex controls movement, stimulate it, and you can actually make different parts of your body twitch.
Like a little remote control for your body.
Pretty much. And the somatosensory cortex processes all your senses, touch, temperature, pain.
So it's like the brain's sensory input center. But this whole brain mapping thing, it's not just for, moving your fingers, right? It gets way more complicated. Oh, definitely. Bloom talks about fMRI studies on patients in a persistent vegetative state. People who seem completely unresponsive.
Right.
But their brains still show activity when they're shown pictures or sounds. Certain areas light up, just like yours or mine would.
So there's still something going on in there, even if they can't show it. It makes you wonder about what consciousness even is.
Exactly. That's one of the biggest mysteries we're still trying to unravel. Speaking of mysteries, Bloom brings up another one that's always fascinated me. Animal consciousness.
Yeah. Does my dog really feel emotions, or am I just projecting my own feelings onto him?
It's a tough one. We can't just ask them, can we? But Bloom points out that even within our own species, conscious experiences can be totally different.
Like that whole, is this dress blue and black or white and gold debate.
Exactly. It shows that even something as basic as color perception can vary. So imagine trying to understand the inner world of another species.
It's like trying to read a book in a language you don't understand. But even within our own minds, there's a lot happening under the surface, right? Like all those sensations our brain is processing that we don't even realize.
All the time. We're bombarded with sights, sounds, smells, but our brains only allow a tiny fraction of that to reach our conscious awareness.
It's like our brain is saying, too much information, got to filter this stuff out.
Exactly, like a spam filter for your senses.
I like that analogy. But that also means we're missing a lot, right?
You got it. That's why you can have those moments where you completely zone out, even in a crowded room.
Like at a party, you can focus on one conversation and everything else just fades into the background.
That's the cocktail party effect. Our attention is limited. We can only really focus on one thing at a time.
And that's why multitasking is a myth. It's really just task switching, and our brains aren't great at it.
Exactly. Especially when it comes to things like driving. Talking on the phone, even hands-free, can mess with your reaction time. It's like trying to juggle while riding a unicycle. Something's got to give.
Not a good visual. Speaking of things our brains have to juggle, let's talk about memory. Bloom tells this crazy story about HM, a guy who couldn't form new memories after brain surgery.
HM is like the poster child for how complex memory is. He lost the ability to form new episodic memories, like what you had for breakfast, or semantic memories, like facts and knowledge.
So imagine waking up every day feeling like it's the first day of your life.
It's wild, right? But here's the kicker. He could still learn new skills, things like riding a bike or playing the piano.
So even though he couldn't remember learning them, his brain was still forming those procedural memories.
Exactly. Shows that different types of memories are handled by different brain regions. It's not just one big memory bank.
The brain is so much more intricate than we realize. But even with all this complexity, our memories can be surprisingly unreliable.
Oh yeah, Bloom talks about that too. The case of Donald M. Thompson, a psychologist who was falsely accused based on a recovered memory, and Elizabeth Loftus's research on how easily memories can be manipulated.
So our memories aren't like video recordings. They're more like stories we tell ourselves. And those stories can change over time.
Right. And that's crucial to remember, especially when it comes to things like eyewitness testimony. Even small changes in wording can affect someone's memory of an event.
It's like someone's subtly editing the story in your mind without you even realizing it.
Exactly. Makes you wonder how much of what we remember is actually true and how much has been shaped by our own biases or external influences.
Okay, so if our memories can be so unreliable, what about our decision-making abilities? Are we as rational as we think we are?
Now that's the million-dollar question. And Bloom dives right into it, exploring all those cognitive biases that trip us up even when we think we're being logical.
So our brains are like, logic? Who needs logic when we have shortcuts?
Pretty much. And those shortcuts, those biases, can lead to some pretty wacky decisions.
So lay it on me. What are some of those biases we should watch out for?
Well, let's start with the availability bias. Quick question. Is it more likely for a word to start with K or have K as the third letter?
Let's say start with K. It's easier to think of those words.
Bingo! That's the availability bias in action. Most people say the same thing, but it's wrong. There are way more words with K as the third letter.
Wait, really?
Yep. Our brains trick us because we tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that easily come to mind.
So it's not just what we know, but also what we can easily remember.
Exactly. That's why vivid or dramatic events like plane crashes can make us overestimate the risks, even though statistically they're rare.
Makes sense. It's like our brains are saying if it's scary and memorable, it must happen all the time.
And then there's base rate neglect. Imagine you get tested for a rare disease. The test is 95% accurate, meaning there's only a 5% chance of a false positive. You get a positive result. How worried would you be?
95% accurate, I'd be freaking out.
Understandable. But here's the thing. You also need to consider how rare the disease actually is.
So even with a positive result, if the disease is super rare, my chances of actually having it are still pretty low.
Exactly. It's like focusing on the fact that you won a small lottery, but forgetting that millions of other people bought tickets too.
Okay, so it's not just about the immediate information. It's about the bigger picture.
You got it. Base rate neglect shows how we can ignore crucial information when making decisions. And Bloom also talks about framing effects.
Framing effects. Those sound familiar, but refresh my memory.
Imagine a public health crisis. 2 treatment plans. Plan A will definitely save 200 lives. Plan B has a 13 chance of saving everyone and a 23 chance of saving no one. Which one do you pick?
Saving 200 lives for sure sounds like the safer bet.
Now, same scenario but worded differently. Plan A will result in 400 deaths. Plan B has a 13 chance of no deaths and a 23 chance of 600 deaths.
Well, now Plan B seems more appealing. But wait, aren't those the same options?
They are. But the way it's presented, the framing, changes how we perceive the risks and benefits.
So our brains are easily swayed by a good story, even if it's not the whole story.
That's the gist of it. And this shows up everywhere, from advertising to political campaigns. Always be wary of how information is being presented.
There are three kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Haha, right. And speaking of being skeptical, we've got to talk about confirmation bias.
Our tendency to, cherry pick information that supports what we already believe.
Exactly. It's like we're all wearing these invisible goggles that filter out anything that challenges our worldview.
So we're all just living in our own little echo chambers.
Kind of. Bloom uses this experiment called Watson's number sequence to illustrate it. People get a sequence of numbers, like 2, 4, 6, and have to figure out the rule. Most assume it's ascending even numbers, and then only test sequences that confirm that.
But there could be tons of other rules that fit. Right.
Absolutely. The rule might be as simple as any 3 ascending numbers, but because of confirmation bias, people miss the obvious.
We're so busy trying to prove ourselves right that we miss out on the truth.
And that's a huge problem, especially with all the misinformation online. Confirmation bias can lead us down some pretty dark rabbit holes.
So how do we fight back against it?
It starts with awareness. Recognize that we all have biases, and then actively seek out diverse perspectives.
It's like we need to train our brains to be more open-minded.
Challenge your assumptions. Look for evidence that contradicts your beliefs. Don't just accept things at face value.
Be a critical thinker, not a confirmation bias junkie. Okay, so we've covered biases and memory, but what about personality? What makes us, us?
Now we're getting into the really fun stuff. Bloom points out that lots of those personality tests you see online aren't very reliable.
So those quizzes telling me I'm a mix of a unicorn and a ninja warrior might not be the most accurate.
Probably not. Bloom focuses on the big 5 personality traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Those sound familiar. So I might be high in openness and extroversion, but low in neuroticism.
Exactly. And research shows that there are some consistent differences between men and women on certain traits.
So maybe those stereotypical gender differences aren't totally unfounded after all.
Could be. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, but those average differences are consistently observed across cultures. And then there's intelligence, that big topic that always sparks debate.
Ah, yes, the IQ test controversy. Bloom doesn't shy away from it, though, does he?
He acknowledges the issues, but points out that IQ scores are still powerful predictors of things like academic achievement and job performance.
So even if IQ tests aren't perfect, they do tell us something about a person's cognitive abilities.
That's the current understanding. And Bloom dives into that classic nature versus nurture debate. Are we born smart, or do we become smart?
It's always a bit of both, isn't it?
Right. Bloom emphasizes that it's not either. Genes definitely play a role, but the environment is huge too.
So even if you have the genetic potential, your environment still shapes how that potential develops.
Absolutely. But here's a twist. Bloom challenges the idea that parenting has this massive impact on a child's personality and intelligence.
Wait, so you're saying all that pressure on parents to raise little Einsteins might be a bit much?
The research suggests that the shared environment, what siblings experience together, doesn't account for as much variation as we thought.
So maybe it's more about those individual experiences and genetic predispositions rather than the specific parenting style.
That seems to be the emerging understanding. And finally, we get to the topic of mental illness.
Always a complex one.
For sure. Bloom reminds us that the line between normal and mentally ill can be blurry. We all feel sad or anxious sometimes.
Right. But when does it cross that line and become something that needs professional help?
That's the key question. Mental illnesses, like physical illnesses, aren't just about symptoms. It's about how intense those symptoms are, how long they last, and how much they impact your life.
So it's not just about feeling sad, it's about how much that sadness is interfering with your ability to function.
Exactly. And like physical illnesses, mental illnesses have both biological and environmental causes. Take schizophrenia, for instance. Strong genetic component, but environmental factors like stress can also trigger it.
It's never a simple one-cause situation.
Nope. It's usually a complex web of factors. And Bloom points out that lots of people experience symptoms of mental illness at some point, but only a small percentage actually meet the criteria for a clinical diagnosis.
So there's a difference between having a bad day, or even a bad week, and having a diagnosable mental illness.
Right. And Bloom touches on depression and how we often talk about it as a chemical imbalance. But he also emphasizes that we still don't fully understand the causes.
So it's not as simple as just popping a pill to fix a chemical imbalance.
And it's much more complex than that.
And then there's this whole concept of neurodiversity.
Oh, yeah, the idea that conditions like autism might not be disorders, but just different ways of thinking.
Different operating systems, so to speak.
I like that. It's about recognizing the diversity of human minds, not just trying to fit everyone into the same box.
Okay, so much to think about already, and we're just getting started.
We've barely scratched the surface, but this is just part one of our deep dive into Bloom's psych.
Stay tuned, folks. We've got a lot more to cover.
So we've explored how our brains work, all those neurons firing away, but now let's talk about something that sets us apart from other animals. Language.
Ah, yes, the gift of gab.
Yeah.
But seriously, it is pretty amazing when you think about it. Thousands of languages, all these different sounds and structures, yet we're able to communicate these complex ideas.
Bloom actually describes this fun experiment he did in his class, where he had students translate the same sentence into their native languages. The sentence was, "The dog thinks the cat bit the rat." Can you imagine?
Oh, that's hilarious. I bet it sounded like a total Tower of Babel in there.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, how do we even learn language in the first place? Is it something we're born with, or do we just pick it up from our environment?
That's the nature versus nurture debate that comes up again and again. And with language, it seems like it's a bit of both. Bloom presents a lot of evidence that we're pre-wired for language, that it's part of our biological makeup.
Okay, so like our brains come with some basic language software already installed.
Something like that. Think about how easily kids pick up language. They don't need formal grammar lessons. They just absorb it.
It's true. It's like they're little language sponges soaking up every word and phrase they hear.
Exactly. And there's evidence from neuroscience to support this. We've actually identified specific areas in the brain, like Broca's area and Wernicke's area, that are all about language processing.
So it's like our brains come with designated language zones.
You got it. But it's not just biology. Our environment, our culture, the specific language we learn, all that plays a role too.
So it's like the hardware is there, but the software is shaped by our experiences.
A good way to think about it. And this gets into what's known as the Horphian hypothesis, the idea that language can actually shape how we think.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that speaking a different language can change the way I see the world?
There's some evidence that supports that, yeah. For example, the Russian language has different words for lighter and darker blues. And some studies have shown that Russian speakers are better at distinguishing between those shades of blue than English speakers.
So like having a richer vocabulary for colors actually changes your perception of color. That's wild.
It is pretty wild. And it might not just be about colors. The structure of our language might also influence how we think about things like time, space, even cause and effect.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. It's like language isn't just a tool for communication, it's also a lens through which we experience reality.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how much of what we think and perceive is shaped by the specific language we speak. But let's break it down a bit and talk about the building blocks of language.
All right, hit me with some Linguistics 101. What are we talking about here?
Well, there are these things called phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and semantics. Think of it like building a house. Phonemes are like the individual bricks, the basic sounds of language.
Okay, I'm following so far. So what are morphemes then?
Morphemes are like the walls and rooms you build with those bricks. They're the smallest units of meaning.
So like prefixes, suffixes, root words, all those little chunks of meaning that we put together.
Exactly. And then you have syntax, which is like the blueprint, the rules for how those walls and rooms are arranged. It's grammar, basically.
Okay, so we've got the bricks, the walls, and the blueprint. What about semantics? Where does that fit in?
Semantics is the meaning you create from all of that. It's about understanding what the house represents, what purpose it serves. It's the meaning behind the words.
I like that. It's like language is architecture for the mind. But how do we even learn all these rules and structures? It seems so complicated.
Bloom talks about babies as being like little statisticians. They're constantly analyzing patterns in the language they hear, figuring out where word boundaries are and how sounds are combined.
So they're not just passively listening. They're actively decoding the language, like little detectives.
Exactly. It's remarkable how quickly they pick it up without any formal instruction.
It's like there's this innate drive to make sense of the world through language.
And that drive has been shaped by evolution. Language has been crucial for human survival and cooperation, so it makes sense that we're so good at it.
Right, it's like language is the ultimate social tool.
Yeah.
But Bloom also explores this idea that language isn't the only way we think.
Yeah, it's easy to assume that all our thoughts are verbal, like little conversations in our heads. But there's a lot of evidence that we can engage in complex thinking without words.
Like when you're trying to solve a visual puzzle or remember a melody.
Exactly. You're manipulating images and concepts, not necessarily using words to think.
So it's like language is just one way of expressing our thoughts, but not the only way we think.
That's what the research suggests. And Bloom points out that language can actually be pretty ambiguous, whereas thoughts are more specific.
Oh, I get that. Like the word bat. It can mean a flying mammal or a baseball bat. The word itself has multiple meanings, but when we think about a bat, we have a specific image in mind.
Right. And this ambiguity is what makes language so interesting, but also so challenging. It relies on shared context and understanding to convey meaning.
It's like language is this amazing tool for connection, but it also requires us to be mindful of how our words might be interpreted.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool, but it comes with responsibility. But let's move on to how we use language to navigate the social world. Bloom explores this in depth, and some of his insights are really eye-opening.
Okay, I'm ready for the social psychology lesson. Hit me with it.
One thing that always fascinates me is how quickly we form impressions of others. Based on just a few seconds, we make judgments about someone's personality, trustworthiness, even their competence.
Oh yeah, those snap judgments. It's like we're all amateur profilers constantly sizing people up.
Yeah.
But how accurate are those first impressions?
That's the big question. Sometimes they're surprisingly accurate, but they can also be wildly off base, especially if we let our biases get in the way.
So it's not just about what we see and hear, but also about what we project onto others.
Exactly. Bloom talks about this study where people were shown short, silent video clips of teachers and asked to rate them. Amazingly, their ratings matched up pretty closely with ratings from students who'd spent a whole semester with those teachers.
Wow, so even from just a few seconds, we're picking up on subtle cues that reveal something about a person's character.
It's pretty incredible, and these snap judgments can have real consequences. Studies show that we're more likely to trust and cooperate with people who seem attractive, competent, and trustworthy.
It's like we have this built-in radar for people who seem like they'll be good social partners.
And that might have evolutionary roots. Back in the day, being able to quickly assess someone's trustworthiness could be a matter of life or death.
Right, you wouldn't want to team up with someone who seems shady, especially if you're facing a saber-toothed tiger. But our social perceptions go beyond just individual judgments. Bloom also talks about how our group memberships shape the way we see the world.
Oh, yes, the power of groups. Bloom talks about this classic experiment called the Robber's Cave experiment.
I've heard about this one. They basically created these fake groups of boys at a summer camp, right?
Yep, just random assignments. But what happened was that even with these totally arbitrary groups, the boys quickly developed this strong in-group loyalty and started competing against the other group.
So even when there are no real differences, we still find ways to divide ourselves into us and them.
It highlights that tribalism thing that seems to be hardwired into us. And this in-group bias can lead to all sorts of problems, from prejudice to discrimination to outright conflict.
It's a reminder that we need to be aware of those group dynamics and work to overcome them. We're all part of the same team, humanity, at the end of the day.
Well said. But it's not just about conscious biases. Bloom also brings up this idea of implicit bias, those unconscious attitudes that can sneak into our behavior.
No, yeah, those are tricky ones. Even if we think we're being totally fair and objective, our unconscious minds might have other ideas.
It's humbling, right? Bloom talks about the implicit association test, the IAT, which measures these unconscious associations we have with different groups.
I've taken that test online before. It's really eye-opening. Even if you consciously reject stereotypes, you might still have these implicit biases lurking beneath the surface.
It's a challenge, for sure, but the good news is that we can address them. Bloom talks about strategies like increasing contact with diverse groups, challenging our assumptions, and promoting empathy.
So it's about actively rewiring those unconscious associations.
Exactly. It takes effort, but it's possible to change those implicit biases over time. But here's a curveball. Bloom argues that not all social biases are bad. He even makes a case for, wait for it, stereotypes.
Wait, stereotypes. But aren't those always negative?
Not necessarily. Bloom points out that stereotypes can actually be helpful mental shortcuts. They're generalizations that allow us to make quick judgments and predictions.
So it's like we need to be careful not to overgeneralize, but stereotypes can sometimes be based on real patterns.
That's the key. They can be useful tools, but they can also be dangerous if we're not careful.
It's like use stereotypes wisely, not blindly.
Well put. It's about recognizing their limitations and being willing to update our beliefs when presented with new information.
This whole discussion about social perception is really making me think. It's like we're all walking around with these complex mental maps of the social world, and those maps are shaped by our experiences, our biases, our group memberships, all of it.
And understanding how those maps work can help us navigate that world more effectively and compassionately.
So much to consider. We've covered so much already, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface of Bloom's book.
You're right. We've explored the vast landscape of the brain, the intricacies of language, and the complexities of social perception. But there's still more to discover. We're just getting started.
Bring on the next round of mind-blowing insights. I'm ready for more.
There's definitely more to uncover. It's like we've explored the basics, the foundations of how our minds work. But now it's time to delve into the deeper questions, the mysteries that still have scientists scratching their heads.
I like that. It's like we've mapped the terrain, but now we're venturing into those uncharted territories. So what are some of those big, unanswered questions that Bloom tackles?
Well, consciousness, for one, it's still a huge enigma. How does this subjective experience, this feeling of awareness, actually arise from the physical matter of the brain?
It's like trying to explain how a symphony emerges from all those individual instruments playing together.
Exactly. We can see the parts, the neurons firing, the brain regions lighting up, but the experience of consciousness is still something we're struggling to grasp.
It's a good reminder that for all our scientific progress, there are still some pretty big mysteries about the human mind.
Oh, absolutely. And Bloom acknowledges that. He doesn't pretend we have all the answers. We're still trying to figure out the nature of the self, how genes and environment interact, the origins of consciousness itself.
It's like we're still piecing together the puzzle, but we're starting to get a glimpse of the bigger picture.
Right. And that's what makes this field so exciting. With all these new tools and technologies like brain imaging and genetic analysis, we're making progress faster than ever before.
It feels like we're on the cusp of some major breakthroughs. Like, imagine if we could diagnose and treat mental illnesses as effectively as we treat physical illnesses.
That's the dream. And Bloom talks about how these advances in understanding the mind could revolutionize so many fields, from education to social policy. But he also emphasizes the ethical implications of this knowledge.
Right. It's not just about what we can do, but also what we should do.
Exactly. We have a responsibility to use these insights wisely and ethically. It's not just about scientific progress, it's about human progress.
Well said. This deep dive into Bloom's psyche has been an incredible journey. We've covered everything from the building blocks of the brain to the complexities of language and social interaction. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of what it means to be human.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and we hope it sparked a curiosity in you, a desire to keep learning and questioning.
It definitely has for me. And I think Bloom's book leaves us with a powerful message. The quest to understand the human mind is an ongoing journey, and there's always more to discover.
So keep those minds engaged, folks.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into psych, the story of the human mind. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world around us.